see you.
Hello again. I'm Melanie Price, still keeping the seat warm for Eddie Robinson. Recent census data reveals that the state's Hispanic, Black, and Asian populations all significantly outgrew the white population in the last decade. In fact, Texans of color accounted for 95% of the state's population growth. With a shared history of racial exclusion, there are many common issues to organize around, but there are also some challenges. How can the state's largest minority groups translate their increasing numbers into greater political power?
Oftentimes, it's these communities that have been shut out of opportunity that long for it and believe in it the most.
Also today, the Underground Railroad to Mexico shows us that alliances between people of color in Texas have a very long history. Remarkable stories of Black and Latino coalition building today on ICU.
The views and opinions expressed by the guests and host on this episode do not necessarily reflect the opinions of staff and management of Houston Public Media.
Welcome to ICU. I'm Dr. Melanie Price. In 1983, Jesse Jackson claimed he was fighting for a rainbow coalition of diverse Americans when he announced his historic candidacy for president. So now in 2021, are people of color still working together to build coalitions in government? We're going to ask two prominent Texas politicians of color, former Secretary Julian Castro and former Harris County Clerk Chris Hollins. First, we talked to Chris Hollins. Chris is an attorney and fourth-generation Houstonian. He was propelled into the national spotlight for his voting policies as the former county clerk. He did this while working in partnership with Harris County Judge Lina Hidalgo. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So one of the things about Houston is that Houstonians love Houston. And I left for grad school a long time ago, and it took me a long time to come back, but you came back pretty quickly. Why was it so important for you to come home?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right? I was born with sort of Houston in me, and I don't know how to shake from it. I was gone actually for 11 years. Mm-hmm. I went to Morehouse. From there, went into consulting practice in Atlanta, brief pit stop at the White House, and then returned to grad school where I got my JD and my MBA. Mm-hmm. And then when I finished all that, that's when I came home. And so I've been home for about 7 years now, mm-hmm. but that calling was always there. It was always, when am I going to come back, not if I'm going to come back.
Right. Did political ambitions play a part in that? Like, did you come back to the city knowing politics is something I want to get into?
I think so. And, frankly, even as a youngster, from all of the reading that I did mm-hmm. and sort of looking forward into the future, I was telling people in college, Texas is going to be a blue state one day, and I want to be a part of that. And everyone was like, you're crazy. And so, I eventually did come back, and then within a couple of years, got really active in the Texas Democratic Party, mm-hmm. where I remain one of the vice chairs today. Mm-hmm. But I did always want to be a part of that. And, we've gotten much closer, right?
Yes.
Back in the year 2004, when John Kerry and President Bush were facing off, Texas went red by 22, 23 points. Mm-hmm. And then fast forward to today, 2020, Joe Biden, of course, won nationally, but in Texas, that margin was shrunk to about 5 points. And so this is a much more purple state than I think people understand. And it's really exciting to be a part of it.
So one of my last questions is going to be, is Texas going to go blue? And can you give me an exact date?
Well, I think that where we are, voter registration is a big deal. Right. There are still millions of unregistered voters out there. I think what we believe to be, upwards of 20 million total eligible voters. And I believe that the majority of the 3 or so million remaining voters out there mm-hmm. would lean towards, center-left policy.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so if you get all those folks registered, if we had universal registration as an example mm-hmm. in Texas, elections would be much tighter today than they are, but that trend is continuing. Again, there's a pretty straight line mm-hmm. towards this being a really, really competitive state. in the presidential election for 2024. But I wouldn't be surprised if with some solid candidates, we see a really competitive and spirited 22 as well.
So what does it mean then when Texas turns blue? Will that increase the political power of Blacks and Latinos from Texas in the nation? Or will people sort of see it as a fluke?
I think that's up to us to determine, right? We have to decide for ourselves, are we going to be a part of the process, right? And of course, look, there are millions of civically engaged Blacks and Hispanics across Texas.
Right.
But there are a significant number of folks who feel left behind by the system, who feel as if when they are involved, they're not necessarily seeing the change that they would want to see at the pace that they want to see that change happen. And that's quite discouraging. And so we have to fight, have to combat that instinct, because I truly believe that the truth is that the way to change the system is to infiltrate the system, to take over the system, to engage in the system versus walking away from it,
Right.
and letting other people determine our fate.
Yeah. You and Judge Lena Hidalgo, the Harris County judge, made an interesting political duo in 2020. Because of the things and the policies that you were implementing and the way you pushed back against people who were trying to prevent you from doing your job. It was also powerful to see two young people of color working to make Houstonians have greater access to the ballot and protect them from COVID. Part of it for me is that when the two of you were working together, it looked like the racial future of Harris County, the racial future of Texas, really. And so were you thinking about the importance of representation in that moment? Like, did the two of you ever say, look at what we are doing? You know what I mean? Are you in the moment just doing the work? Or are you also thinking about the importance of representation?
You know, I honestly will tell you that I don't think we had the benefit of being able to be that reflective in the moment, right? When we spent time together, you know, it was about the business of Harris County, about the fight that we were in together to protect the right to vote here in Harris County, amongst all of the other challenges that she was facing as county judge during the time of COVID-19 and is frankly is still facing today. We are proud to be preserving democracy at a time when democracy itself is being attacked. But when I have that moment of reflection, and I've been able to do that since stepping away from office, it was really, really impressive and inspiring. You know, we had not totally similar paths to being in office, but she was someone who was elected at the age of 27, who nobody gave a shot. And then once she was elected, who many people left for dead and said, you know, she's going to flounder.
Right.
And she's proven those folks wrong in spades, right? She's been the kind of leader that we need for the moment. And then for myself, you know, I was appointed after a surprising, you know, resignation by my predecessor. I had not been in election administration before. I had not held public office before, you know, again, in my younger 30s. And there were a lot of questions of, you know, does this guy have what it takes? What are we going to see from him? And I think that, you know, with the team that we were able to put together, along with the hundreds of public servants and thousands of volunteers, I think we showed that what we can do as a community when we work together.
Right. It's how I always tell my students that critical thinking is the most important skill you can ever get out of college. It doesn't matter what else you learn there. If you can critically think and problem solve, then you have a very long way to go. I think as we look at the new census data and we look at sort of the Texans of color as the majority, one of the most important things to watch for now is how Blacks and Latinos engage each other politically. Would you agree with that? And so what do you see as some of the common issues which you think they might want to organize around?
Yeah, I mean, well, certainly here in Texas, you know, Blacks and Latinos are the traditional minority groups, right? But I wouldn't count out, you know, the Asian population.
Right. Which was the fastest growing in the census. Asian Americans grew, they're a small number, but their growth was bigger than anybody else's.
And in counties like Fort Bend County, which is, I think, one of the most diverse counties in the country, I believe that Asians are now the plurality, you know, in that county. And so there's a huge base of power there. And we're seeing not only that population grow, but members of the Asian community becoming more engaged and involved at a really fast clip.
Right. And they have a South Asian judge as their county judge.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's phenomenal. And we have South Asian judges on the district judges on the bench here in Harris County. And It's really, really fascinating and, again, inspiring to see. And so I wouldn't just limit it to Blacks and Latinos. I think that we all need to come together. And look, obviously progressive, Anglo folks as well, to say, how can we, as this diverse state, diverse county, diverse group of people, come together to make sure that the future that we're leaving for our children is going to be better than what we had, whether as Houston residents or coming from other parts of the country or total, other countries altogether.
So you've been a leader in this fight against the laws that are being put on the books in Texas around voting. For me, as a person who teaches Black politics, as a person who teaches American politics, it looks like a retrenchment. It looks like we're going back to voting laws of the 1950s. Tell me a little bit about what it's like to be in that fight, what it's like to be in a multiracial group of people fighting for that, and why people of color and white should be so concerned about it.
Absolutely. You're right. As a student of history, what you see is that as you make progress, there's always going to be that backlash, from the Civil War and freedom and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. You saw Jim Crow and an absolute retrenchment, particularly in the southern part of the United States. Then we had a Texan who many viewed as conservative, go to D.C., become president in an unexpected way, and who put together with a broad coalition the most meaningful, civil rights legislation in our nation's history. And that led to what we would consider sort of full and true voting rights across this entire nation.
Right.
And particularly, again, in the southern United States, where laws had been put in place to make it so much harder for people of color to cast ballots. Now we move forward.
And that Texan you're talking about is
none other than Lyndon Baines Johnson, a personal hero of mine.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice.
And so fast forward, 50 years, and what you're seeing, again, in traditional conservative strongholds like Georgia, like Arizona, and like Texas, that needle is moving. And those who are in power see that the coalition that put them in office, in power, is shrinking. And that if majority rule were to rule in this country, that they would be out of power, not only today, but for a generation, if not multiple generations.
Right.
And so how do you win that game? You change the rules, right? You keep the folks who are on the other side from being able to participate in a fair way. And then you try to hold on while your opponent has one or two hands tied behind their back. And so that, to me, is 100% un-American. Right. It flies in the face of what it means to be a free country, what it means to be a Republican democracy, and what it means to have the constitutional right to vote in this country. And so that's why I've been so passionate and so involved in this fight, not because of progressive policy over conservative policy, the red team versus the blue team, but because if we are going to have a free country, if we're going to have the America that we believe that we have today and that we sort of may aspire to have in the future, this more perfect union, then we have to have democracy. And that's the fight that we're in right now.
So do you think that the current political climate in Texas and across state houses across the country, how much of it is being driven by this sort of, Public Enemy would call it fear of a black planet, right? But how much of it is being driven by the changing demographics and the desire to stay in power? That seems so naked, like naked kind of power grabs. But do you see it as something bigger than that?
It's not much bigger than that. What it comes down to is the true people in power, which frankly are billionaires sort of sitting atop of all this calling shots. Those folks want to have their minions in halls of power in various states and in D.C., and they're saying we're going to do this however we can. And the path that they've taken is through white supremacy, through making folks who probably should be supporting policies to have health care, to have better public education, to have a fair shot for working families, and instilling fear in them that says, those folks over there, not me, the billionaire,
Right.
but those folks over there who have a different skin color than you, they're coming to take what's yours.
Right.
And so that's a major part of it. And those seeds of fear certainly work to divide us and again, keep us as from a multiracial, coalition of coming together to protect the middle and lower class in this country.
So I strongly believe that a person of color who can win statewide office in Texas immediately becomes a contender for the Democratic nomination for president. Right? Whoever can reach that hurdle. In some ways, like we imagine Kamala Harris, if she decides to run in 2024, she has California potentially at her back. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's overstating sort of the power of being elected statewide here in Texas?
I think it might be understating it. You talk about Kamala in California, that state's probably going to be in the blue column regardless.
Right.
And so if you had somebody who could carry Texas,
right,
so goes Texas, so goes the nation.
Right.
And so you're exactly right. If there was a statewide leader in Texas, especially a person of color, who could strengthen, the Democratic coalition, that person should be a no-brainer for a Democratic ticket.
One of the things, this is the last thing I'm going to ask you, and I'm going to talk to Secretary Castro too. I'm going to ask him the same question. How would you convince African Americans who might see Latinos as competitors rather than allies that coalition building is better than any other option?
That's a great question. And again, as I mentioned before, we have to talk about a broad coalition. So we have to have that same conversation with folks in the Hispanic and Latino community, that same conversation with folks in the Asian community.
Right.
And then even across other lines, right? We have to talk about Christians, Jews, and Muslims working together, gay and straight communities working together, immigrants versus folks who were born here.
Right.
Working together. But what I know is that there is a united opposition, right? We have folks who believe that, straight white males should be the only ones turning the gears of power in this country, and that they should be doing so to serve the interests of millionaires and billionaires, and that's how it should be. And they're united in that goal, and they're well-resourced, and they're disciplined. And so if we're over here duking it out with each other instead of taking on that battle, then we're going to lose every single time. I don't know if we had to bring in some sort of Marvel reference or like a Wakanda reference.
Avengers, with me.
Right, we can go fight for who's going to be the king over here.
Right.
But then when we have that existential threat, which right now, again, it goes even beyond trying to take away our rights and our livelihoods. And there is a political party in this country that does not believe that democracy should exist anymore, period. And you can look across many countries across the world who either have never had a democracy or who have had one that is then moved into a more authoritarian form of government. And we don't want to live in a country like that. And so we don't have to talk about issues like healthcare and education and all those things that I believe are truly important. Let's just talk about living in a free country, in a democracy to begin with. And we're going to lose that if we don't come together, again, as this coalition, as folks who want to see the best for ourselves, for our neighbors, for our families, and who are willing to work to see it happen.
Chris Hollins is a former county clerk for Harris County, Texas, who made big headlines in 2020. And I truly believe that we're going to see a lot more of him in the future. Thank you so much for spending time with me. This was great.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Coming up on ICU, the former mayor of San Antonio who became a leader in the Obama administration. Team building across the color barrier with Julian Castro when we come back. Welcome back to ICU. I'm Melanie Price, and my next guest is Secretary Julian Castro. Julian Castro is the former mayor of San Antonio, Texas, and was HUD secretary during the Obama administration. He was among the candidates for the Democratic nomination in the 2020 presidential race, after which he launched People First Future to elect bold progressive candidates across the nation. Welcome, Secretary Castro.
Thanks for having me.
I should tell you that I've paid a lot of attention to you and your brother's political ascent because I'm a twin, right? And I have a twin sister, and we're both professors. So we're also in the same profession. And so my family is completely interested in how the two of you navigate this. As a matter of fact, my mom says, is that the one with the beard or the one without the beard?
No, I'm the one without the beard.
Yes.
And I'm the good twin, too. He's the evil one.
Right. That's, of course. And I'm also the good twin. So if you ever meet her, she sucks. Yeah. She sucks, right? So I was thinking during the election, if your twin becomes president, I'm not sure what you do after that for your family can ever match anything after that.
No doubt. If I had one, I certainly would have topped him for forever. He would have had
the king of the Castro twins. Like it
eluded me. It eluded me.
Yes. So my sister and I love to say that we support all brown twins from Texas, all of them. So we're big Castro brothers fans. So during the election, you were very outspoken about the role of racism in American life. Why was it important for you to talk about that? And how do you think it shaped how voters saw you?
In our country, we're only ever going to be able to get over the original sin of slavery and racism if we confront it head on and understand how systemic racism still impacts so many people in the United States in the 21st century, and be smart about it, be constructive and smart about how we address that with policy. And that's what I tried to do in the presidential race, whether we were talking about changes in policing or housing or our economic system.
So I was interested in having this conversation about Black Latino relations in the state of Texas and in the nation, really. And it was inspired by two things that happened in 2020. One was the work between Chris Hollins and Judge Lina Hidalgo in Harris County. And the other was you and Maya Rupert, right? Mm-hmm. So as an African-American woman who studies politics, I was drawn to your partnership with another African-American woman, Maya Rupert. Talk a little bit about how that relationship came to be. And I'm very interested. I got to believe that there were people who were saying, no, don't do this.
Maya's fantastic. She worked with me when I was the HUD secretary. And I said back then, she served in the general counsel's office and then as a senior advisor. I said back then that wherever I went next, I wanted to make sure that Maya was a part of that because she was smart, she was creative, she could work well with teams, she was a good leader. And I didn't know at that time that the next thing that I would get into or try would be running for president.
I am a candidate for president of the United States of America.
But I knew that no matter what it was, that she would add a lot of value to it. And she did. It was something new to both of us. I had never run for president before. She had never managed not just a presidential campaign, but a political campaign.
But in some ways, that's good, though. You both are sort of bumbling through it together, and you don't know when you don't know the rules, then you can break the rules and not, be very nervous about it, maybe.
Absolutely. And there was nobody that would have wanted to go through that experience with more than with Maya, because there wasn't a single moment in the campaign where I felt like she didn't have it under control, where I felt like that I wasn't, and our campaign wasn't in good hands. I always had confidence, and still do, in her. And I think a lot of the successes that we had on policy and on being able to sort of peer ahead of the curve and be early on issues that became even more prominent after the cycle ended, whether it's policing or which state is going to go first in the Democratic primary or immigration or any number of things. A lot of that was Maya. And I called her the conscience of the campaign as well. She kept us very honest about the values that we embraced and how we needed to live those values out in the campaign.
Right. And so for me, I thought watching you, I was like, this sort of is the future of the state of Texas, but in some ways it's the future of the nation as we become increasingly racial minority majority, right? Which is a funny thing to say, but also as we become increasingly a country of people of color, then thinking about how those groups work together is really sort of helping us understand what the potential future will look like, right? So why do you think it's important for people of color to work in solidarity with each other?
It's important because the destiny of people of color, Black and brown, Asian American, Native American folks, and white folks in this country is all tied together. We got these census numbers 2 weeks ago. We're more diverse than we ever have been. That's especially true, of course, in states like Texas.
Right.
So the destiny of Texas and of this country is going to depend on the success of all of us. And there often also have been common experiences. We haven't had the same experience, right, in Black and brown communities, but common experiences, common struggles, common obstacles. So it behooves both of these communities to work together to achieve greater political empowerment and economic empowerment in our country.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we probably should think about is sort of what are those issues that unite us. So, if you were preparing a campaign in the state and you wanted to figure out how you could sort of unite different minority groups, what would be some of the issues that you think would unite us?
I think there's a whole set of them, starting with, oftentimes it's these communities that have been shut out of opportunity that long for it and believe in it the most. Universal pre-K and building a great education system, because we know that in Black and brown communities, the education system has often failed us. Access to higher education. Same thing on healthcare. It's both of these communities we've seen with this coronavirus experience that have been hit the hardest. And I think about issues like policing. To be especially a Black man in this country is on a scale that's just different from everybody else in terms of how they're treated by law enforcement, but the numbers aren't that good either with respect to Native Americans and with Latinos. And so there's a commonality there of wanting to see change, wanting to see effective reform. You mentioned immigration. People often think of immigration as a brown person's issue, when we know that there are many Black immigrants that get left out of the conversation oftentimes. Y'all see them in Houston, as you mentioned. I mean, the community is this super diverse community. Same thing, I would say, with the Asian American community, which is very affected by the policy of this nation on immigration. So it makes sense on a whole set of issues that are central to the empowerment of both of these communities and beyond, that we unite, that we form coalitions and try and mobilize people on the ground to get out there and vote.
One of the things that makes me think about is the 2020 election and all of the discussion about Latino voter turnout in Texas, right? And the number of people who were surprised by the number of Latinos in Texas who supported Trump. Why do you think that was the case? Should people have been surprised by it?
There were some of those counties down in South Texas, and it wasn't that many counties. It was just probably just less than a handful. But there were some counties where the numbers flipped. And to me, what it says is we can't take anybody for granted. We have to go down there and organize in Spanish and English, 24/7, 365 days a year, not just when it's 4 months before the election. And to make sure that we're showing people the value of voting for Democrats, and to ensure that we're speaking to them in terms that connect, that resonate. We also, I think, have to do a good job of being inclusive in terms of who's running for office, who's being appointed to different offices, so that folks see themselves reflected in those leadership positions, and they feel an affinity both with the Democratic Party and, in general.
So I talked to Chris Hollins before you, and I wanted to ask two questions to both of you. I wanted to be sure to repeat those two questions. And the first one I wanted to say is, how would you convince Latinos who might see African Americans as political competitors rather than allies? What would you say to convince them that coalition building is better?
That there is strength in numbers of these two communities that oftentimes are in very similar situations economically and politically, and through the generations have been largely left out of power. There's strength in numbers to coalesce, to create more opportunity and more power for both. Also, just, you look at the history of our country, and my mother was a Chicana activist, part of the Chicano movement. And they took so many of the lessons of the broader African-American-led civil rights movement and tried to apply that to Hispanic advancement, but also with allies who were veterans of that larger African-American-led civil rights movement. For many generations, there has been a commonality, a coalescence, a sisterhood and brotherhood that have helped each other to advance. And in fact, I would argue that's largely the only way that we have advanced for the Latino community is with the help of the African American community in our nation. And so I would say to somebody, if you're thinking about how we're going to advance in the 21st century, if you're thinking about how we're going to create greater opportunity for everybody, then it only makes sense to coalesce instead of to compete.
And the second question is Texas ever going to go blue? And if so, can you give me a specific date? I'd really like to know the exact date.
It will. But I have to confess that if somebody rolled the tape on what I've said in years past, I've probably said before it's going to happen this year. So I don't want to be the boy who cried wolf. But what I will say is 2012, Obama loses Texas by 16 points. 2020, Biden loses Texas by 5.5 points. In 2018, in between, we picked up 12 state house seats, 2 state senate seats, and 2 congressional seats. Texas is moving very clearly in a Democratic direction. The census figures that just came out give me hope as well, because it's so many of the voters that vote Democratic that are growing in this state. So, I think within these next couple of cycles that we're going to see a turning over. Beto O'Rourke got within 2.5 points of Ted Cruz 3 years ago in 2018. I saw that as just a sign of what was to come.
I'm going to let you go, but I have to ask you about the passage of the voting bills in the state of Texas and what that means for voting going forward. It's very discouraging, particularly for my students at Prairie View who have been involved in this fight for a very long time. Sort of, what is the outlook? What do you see on the horizon for how that's going to be fixed?
It is troublesome. I think it's dangerous because these voter suppression bills, including Texas, are just meant to keep people away from the polls. They're meant to create a chilling effect so people don't exercise their right to the ballot. And what we need to do is push back as much as we can at the state level, but really the action needs to be at the federal level. The siren, the red warning light is going off for the filibuster to be set aside so that the For the People Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act can be passed in D.C. and have retroactivity so that the bill that was passed here in Texas, passed in other states, they never go into effect in our state. That's what needs to happen. If it doesn't happen, it's going to be an even bigger uphill climb, and it's going to demoralize people because, how do you convince folks that their vote counts? How do you convince them to actually get out and vote in the first place if they feel like the whole thing is rigged by this party that wants to stay in power?
Secretary Castro, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a really great pleasure.
Thanks a lot. Good to be with you.
After the break, coalition building between Latinos and African Americans has a longer history than you might think. The Underground Railroad to Mexico when we come back. Though most stories of self-emancipation by people who were enslaved focus on the desire to go north, getting to Canada must have seemed like a trip to Mars for blacks who were enslaved in Texas. They were, however, very close to another territory where slavery was illegal, Mexico. The southern route of the Underground Railroad is lesser known, but of immense importance to Black and Latino history in Texas. Today, we'll learn more about that from a historian, Maria Esther Hammock. Maria is the McNeil Center postdoctoral fellow and professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Let's start with why Mexico was so attractive for blacks enslaved in Texas. Why would they want to go there?
Well, interestingly enough, there were several different pulls and push factors that situated Mexico or Mexican spaces as safe havens. The first is the geographic proximity to places where enslaved persons of African descent were held. So if you think about the American South, we think about, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, Missouri. You think the proximity to Mexican spaces or Mexican waters. If you were enslaved in Louisiana, you can try to flee, get on a boat, and make it across the Gulf. If you were enslaved in places like Texas, you could just head south through the trails and pathways that you could engineer and then make it to Mexican spaces as well, which is a lot different to say that if they had to cross all the northern states to get to Canadian destinations. So perhaps the geographic proximity is an important thing, but also the fact that Mexico, since the beginning of its independence movement from the colonizer, from Spanish control, the people who were fighting for freedom from Spanish control, they were hoping to not only secure freedom for Mexico from Spain, but they hoped to live in a country where they could also be free. And the people that were pushing for independence were people of African descent, of Native descent, and that mostly they were at some point enslaved themselves. So the other aspect that pushed or pulled people to Mexican spaces were Mexico's anti-slavery stance and abolitionist legislation that was slow to brew, but it was in process between 1810 and 1829.
So we've seen lots of movies about the push forward. I'm thinking most recently about the movie Harriet, about Harriet Tubman and her work on the Underground Railroad. Can you tell us a little bit about what freedom in Mexico was like? So when people who made it to Mexico got there, do you know about what their life was like? How hard was it with the language barrier? Was that a problem for them at all? Like, what do we know about them?
That's a wonderful question. So I'm going to answer this first in like three sections. The first is the language. A lot of individuals always ask about, or I'm always asked about the language. What I have encountered in my studies was that a lot of individuals who were seeking freedom in Mexican spaces, they either understood the language or they knew the language well, or they knew other languages that facilitated mobility south of slavery. So I mined thousands of runaway slave ads and newspaper articles on both sides of the border. What appeared time and time again was that this person ran away, and this person is fluent in English, Spanish, and French. And you keep coming up with that. And so when you realize the spaces that these individuals were held enslaved, you see that there was always people moving in and out. So they understood the language. They were Spanish speakers, French speakers, English speakers. So as opposed to the mythology that individuals held enslaved did not know how to read or write or did not know anything, they really did have all these skills and knowledges that enabled them to pursue their own liberation. And a lot of them could speak not only one language, but several.
I don't know why that's blowing my mind, but it really is. So I know recently the federal government started an emancipation trail from Galveston to Houston to sort of learn more about this history of enslavement in Texas. And that made me wonder, are there safe houses that still exist? Are there artifacts that still exist of this Underground Railroad? Do we have a sense of how it worked? Are there places we can visit to learn more about it?
So the mobility and freedom fighting that was engineered across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands truly does different from those that we consider as the Underground Railroad that led to Canadian destinations. As we have grown to learn about that in American history, we learn about the officers and the very, established networks of assistance that the Underground Railroad that led to Canada consisted of. But across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, these networks were different in the sense that if they were more individualized, they were pursued individually or by groups or by individuals. So there are some landmarks where people would seek freedom or refuge for brief moments or months or as they made their way south. I came across some caves where people would hide as they tried to make that trek, but I also came across spaces owned by free Black Texans, for instance, that were spaces where they could secure refuge or, to live, and if they didn't want to go all the way to a Mexican space or across the borderlands. But when we think about sites and safe havens, that is a history that we still need to uncover, those sites and places. But I do have some knowledge based on the work that I'm doing of some sites that were integral to these movements, but who may not be available for public visitation. There might be some of these spaces are privately owned, so there is less of an accessibility to these spaces as opposed when we think about sites that people utilize to head to northern spaces.
Right. I know you're a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and in Philadelphia, there are houses that were used on the Underground Railroad all over that city, and they're commemorated in a certain kind of way. Seems like that's something that maybe your public history work seems like getting some of those spaces here in Texas commemorated too also makes sense. So
it reminded me about this landmark that I was told about after one of my presentations a few years back. This man came up to me and said, my friend has this shed in the middle of his property in South Texas, and the stories that have passed down through his family say that his family were of German ancestry, and they used to hide people in the basements of that shed because the basements were constructed there for the purpose of hiding stuff or storing stuff. And so he's like, I'm sure he will like to let you come and visit because that is a story that runs in his family. After a few months of trying to get to meet the individual, this person who told me about it said, well, my friend doesn't really want to bring attention to it. I don't know why, but he doesn't want to discuss it. And so you encounter those problems across the border where people, there might be sites, but they're not accessible.
I mean, this is so fascinating to me. I'm thinking about the Fugitive Slave Act and how when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, it allowed slave hunters to go into any territory they wanted to retrieve them. And I'm wondering how that impacted this southern route. Were the escapes plentiful enough for them to notice? And if so, how did they respond to it?
Absolutely. So the Fugitive Slave Act came to really change a lot of the spaces of freedom that Black Americans could secure their liberation at. It meant that they couldn't go to northern spaces or northern cities because, slave hunters will go and patrol them and make sure that if they thought you were a runaway slave, they would bring you back, or if they thought that you were, even if they didn't really know, but they thought you were, they would kidnap you and bring you down south. But across the U.S.-Mexico border, slave hunters had no jurisdiction going into Mexican spaces to retrieve people that were free. And throughout the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and through the 60s, early 60s, not only the federal government of the U.S., but state governments would send requests to Mexico for the amicable retrieval of runaway slaves. And one of the very interesting points that I found out that I didn't even grow up knowing was that Mexico profusely refused to sign extradition treaties where Mexico would return people that were free. As opposed to, for instance, and that's something that I actually learned a couple years ago when I was conducting research in Canada, that Canada did sign a treaty where slaveholders could extradite or get who they consider their property back from Canadian destinations of freedom. So that's one thing that made me question, why don't we learn about Canada signing extradition treaties, but we don't learn about Mexico not signing them? Or the same, yeah.
So I've known for years that there are places in Mexico that celebrate the emancipation of blacks enslaved in Texas, or the holiday that we now know, that the world now knows as Juneteenth. Is this the result of the Southern Underground Railroad? Is it connected in some way?
Not necessarily, but it does have some connection. So Juneteenth was a celebration that came about because when emancipation happened, federal emancipation, Texas refused to actually free the enslaved persons living in the space of Texas, in the state of Texas. So it wasn't until several years later, in 1865, when the federal government, the United States, they had to send in the National Guard to make sure that slaveholders abided by federal law. So that's when June 19th, 1865, General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston to basically force slaveholders to free enslaved persons who had been free for several years, but they hadn't been allowed to claim that freedom. And so where this history connects to Mexican spaces was that before the Civil War in the early 1850s, a group of Seminole people and Black Seminoles left places like Oklahoma to live better lives in Mexican spaces. And so they reached Mexico in 1850. They asked the Mexican government for protections, land, and citizenship, and Mexico offered that. And these individuals lived in Mexico as, in established lands, which some of those communities today exist, that their descendants still own that land and they live there. But one of the interesting things that happened was sort of like a double migration. So after 1865, these individuals had been living free in Mexico since the late 40s, early 50s. But when 1865 happens, June 19th, some of these families, a few members of these communities moved across the border and settled in a sister city called Brackettville. And so in Brackettville, the celebrations of Juneteenth, was a thing. They were celebrating freedom. So because we had this connection of these families had been living free in Mexico, the celebration became sort of like a form of allyship, a form of celebrating freedom for their American brethren who, had just secured their liberation on June 19th, but not necessarily because they became free on June 19th on Mexican spaces, because they had been living there free. But it became a global celebration. Today, Juneteenth is celebrated in El Nacimiento and in other communities in northern Coahuila. And basically because this has become a family, sort of like a family reunion. People from Brackettville go to Mexico to celebrate, and then people from Mexico come to Brackettville to celebrate Juneteenth. Unfortunately, a couple of years ago, I actually went to Brackettville to one of the celebrations in September, and a lot of the Mexican family members couldn't come because they couldn't, they weren't allowed in the country with the paperwork they didn't have. So
interesting the way in which borders can separate families. We don't think about that in terms of African American history, but very much so in this case. What do you think, knowing this kind of history about not just Black people in Texas and people in Mexico, but about Black people in Texas and Texans of Mexican descent and the ways in which they work together? Why do you think it's important for us to know these kinds of stories?
One of the things that I consider to be most important about these histories is how they challenge traditional views that we have come to learn and that are taught in school. And these traditional views not necessarily include Black and brown people. They exclude Black and brown people, but in addition to that, they are very anti-Black. And so Black roots have been erased due to lack of education or lack of understanding, or that same anti-Blackness and racism. And I think that that's one of the most important goals, is to make sure that we disseminate these histories, that we bring them to light, to highlight the importance and the foundational contributions of Black Americans across the shared borderlands, across the shared spaces, that they not only shape, like, their presence and their fight for liberation not only shaped Texas or the U.S., but it foundationally shaped Mexican spaces as well.
It's always interesting with students when you talk to them about slavery in Latin America and how in this country because of our own fraught history with slavery, we mostly think about slavery here and maybe in the Caribbean, but rarely think about Latin America as a part of the transatlantic slave trade. And what you do is you make those borders more porous for us and help us understand the ways in which people were not just moving north or not just moving towards freedom or following the drinking gourd, as they call it, but people were also moving towards Latin American spaces as well.
I do want to point out, because I think this is important to bring up, that once Black Americans reached Mexican spaces, everything was not just, happy and they were free. Individuals who reached and claimed liberation in Mexican spaces kept having to continue fighting for that freedom. They had to, learn how the system worked. They had to have, fight for access to that freedom that Mexico promised. It's not that Mexico granted them anything. The laws were there, but they had to be active in fighting for, if they wanted citizenship, if they wanted to find jobs, if they wanted to find a house, buy a house, settle, they still had to fight for that. As we know, Mexico is a place that continues to have discrimination and racism and anti-Blackness. And I think that these stories, I hope, help bring awareness to that and to bring change to future generations.
Thank you so much for your research. I can't wait to read this book that's coming out of this. I can't wait to see the documentary. I'm sure there'll probably be movies. I don't know, but I imagine there will be lots of great things happening connected to this. Thank you so much. Maria Esther Hammack is the McNeil Center postdoctoral fellow and professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you so much for getting us started on learning more about the Underground Railroad South.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
That's it for today. But next week on ICU, it's homecoming season for historically Black colleges and universities. And what's the most important part of an HBCU homecoming? The band. Homecoming traditions with band directors and some surprising band members next week. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Our show team includes technical director Todd Hulslander, producers and editors Matthew Bura, Mark DeClaudio, and Laura Burks, and sound designer Dave McDermott. I'm Melanie Price, filling in for Eddie Robinson. Thank you so much for listening.